I'm Gilbert Baker, State Senator in Conway. I've served in the legislature going on 12 years now, Republican from Conway, Faulkner County, and I am co-chair of the Joint Budget Committee. The Joint Budget Committee in the legislature has a group of 28 senators and 28 reps that come together to make up 56 members. Each Senate and House each has a chairman that come in. Representative Kathy Webb from Little Rock is the House chair, and I am the Senate chair, and we co-chair the committee. All budget bills, all appropriation bills, basically anything to do with the state's finances have to first come through the budget committee. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about the upcoming fiscal session, which begins February 13, 2012. It will only be the second fiscal session we've had. The voters approved a constitutional amendment requiring that we have a fiscal session in the even year every year, in addition to what was already in the Constitution, and that is a regular session which convenes the second Monday of every odd year. So this is only the second fiscal session that Arkansas has ever had. I had the good fortune of being budget chair in the previous cycle, so I was the first Senate budget chairman, and now going into my second fiscal session. The process is set up really in two components. Actually, starting on January the 17th, we will begin budget hearings, which are held by the Joint Budget Committee, and again co-chairs Representative Webb, Senator Baker, and we will go through a process where we will review the budgets, starting with the big six agencies. The big six agencies are higher ed, K-12 education, corrections, community corrections, the health department, and human services. Any other state agency that a particular legislator wants to review can also be brought to the budget hearing process. And at this time we are going to hear from career education, we're going to hear from workforce services, and we're also going to hear from the Forestry Commission, which, as many know, has been somewhat controversial recently. And so those are the agencies we're going to officially review during this 3-week budget hearing process. The agency will come in, explain their needs, articulate the governor's recommendations for these different agencies, and then the budget committee in the budget hearing process will decide how the particular appropriation bill for that each agency will be written. That's the purpose of the hearing process, is to tell the staff what we want the bills to look like as we first officially review them on February the 13th. So that's the budget hearing process, is simply to have hearings on what posture we want those appropriation bills to come to us in the fiscal session. It's important to understand appropriation bill is the legal document, the law that allows an agency to spend money. Without an appropriation, no one can spend money in Arkansas. No agency of the state can spend money in Arkansas. But that is different than the actual amount of money that an agency may have. That's where you have a difference between appropriation and actual funding. So important. A lot of fight, a lot of discussion goes into our appropriation bills, and they are simply the mechanism by which an agency can spend money. But a lot less is said about the actual funding that goes forward. We will spend 3 weeks. We will end our budget hearings toward the end of January, giving staff a couple of weeks to then draw up the actual bills in bill form, the appropriation bills for each agency. We will then officially go into session on February the 13th. A little pomp and circumstance, a joint meeting of the House and Senate with Governor Beebe explaining his budget priorities, because keep in mind in the fiscal session we are limited to only dealing with appropriation bills. No other item may be taken up unless a special resolution is passed on the first day of the fiscal session by a supermajority of the House and the Senate. You can bring up other matters in the fiscal session, but you must first have a resolution passed that is introduced day one. And then within the next few weeks, few days actually, that resolution has to be passed by a supermajority of each House, the House and the Senate. Then you are allowed to introduce a bill that is not appropriation. And we really limit fiscal session to appropriation bills only. Try to do that. We then will again review those bills, the appropriation bills, and make some more changes to those appropriation levels. Again, the ability to spend money. Then toward the end of the session, as we know what our revenues are going to be, we know what the governor's priorities are, we've looked at each agency, so now we know the legislature has a feel for its priorities. We will then start putting together the Revenue Stabilization Act. It is a bill, and it is not an appropriation bill. So one of the most important things we do on day one of the fiscal session is we introduced a resolution to allow us to even discuss revenue stabilization. Because it is through the Revenue Stabilization Act, Revenue Stabilization Law, that we actually put funding into agencies. Every session that's required. In the old days, we would pass a 2-year Revenue Stabilization Act, but since we now have yearly sessions, we do it 1 year at a time. Keeping in mind that if this law is not passed, the RSA, then we simply revert back to the previous RSA funding. And to my knowledge, we've never done that. So appropriation bills will be discussed, will be passed. They have to be passed by the Budget Committee, and then they're sent to the House, and then to the Senate, or to the Senate and to the House. Again, it takes a supermajority to pass an appropriation bill. Once both chambers pass it, it goes to the governor for signature. And then at the last part of the session, leadership will meet with the governor and decide, based on the amount of money we think we're going to bring in the next fiscal year, how much we should actually fund in these areas. Short story, as far as looking at this session, it looks like there's going to be about $160 million new dollars over the last fiscal session. The governor has indicated that he would like to take about $114 million of those dollars, new dollars, and add them to the Medicaid budget, which has grown over the years with the needs out there in Medicaid. He also wants to put $58 million in the K-12 public school system, which is required by the Constitution, which is required by the adequacy law, per the Lakeview case. The legislature has said to have an adequate education, looks like we're going to have a 2% increase. It's about $58 million. In addition, he's talked about some new money to higher ed, some small amount of money to our correction system. So that's how the governor has kind of in broad outlines decided how he wants to spend the $160 million. And again, that's funding that we'll talk about at the end as we build our Revenue Stabilization Act. The Revenue Stabilization Act, again, is debated and discussed and crafted with the governor and Senate and House leadership, and it is then put in a bill form that the Budget Committee must review and act on. Once it passes the Budget Committee, it must also be passed by only 51 votes in each chamber, and then the governor signs it, and our job is done. We have then given an ability to spend money to each agency, actually given them certain amounts of funding, most of the time much lower than what they are allowed to spend. That has to do with possible other grants that would come in, or other revenue sources, or just to, in effect, pad the appropriation. But it is the funding that's the key. And those are the two main things we'll do in the fiscal session. Pass laws that allow them to spend money, pass the Revenue Stabilization Act, which actually has money flow in to each agency, and preceding that, budget hearings, which are simply a process to take a more detailed look at each agency and tell the staff how to prepare those appropriation bills for the beginning of the fiscal session. It's not rocket science, but it is a little bit confusing. The good news is we will not spend or even project to spend $1 more than we think we're going to bring in. Through the next fiscal year, if the folks that make those decisions about forecast, if they are wrong and the revenues do not come in, then the governor is required to come in and change the forecast and simply reduce the amount of money that would flow. Appropriations don't change, because again, that's just the allowable money to be spent, but revenue stabilization amounts will change per the forecast, and that's why Arkansas has not been officially in debt since 1947, when Governor Ben Laney created the Revenue Stabilization Act. It is simply a law that every legislature has to pass. It is a good law. It is not constitutionally required. Simply the weight of Arkansans keeping an eye on government, saying we don't want to spend more than we bring in, has literally locked in Republicans, Democrats, Conservatives, Liberals, Greens, whoever, till we have our forecast, we get in a room. Conservatives may want to cut taxes, that's fine. How are you going to make that match with cutting services? Others may want to add services. Okay, where are you going to find the revenue to pay for the services? Nobody gets what they want in the way of tax cuts or services or some combination, but we do come together within the constraint of our revenue projections. So that's the fiscal session. Starts February 13th. We'll go for about 30 days. Last year, which was the first one, went 24 days. We might extend a little past 24. We're allowed to go 30. If we want to go past 30, the Constitution says we can pass a supermajority vote to go to 45. We absolutely under no circumstance can go past 45. I venture to say this time we'll stay 24, 25, maybe 26 days. Get the people's business done, and spend all of the money we project we're going to bring in. That covers the fiscal session. Again, I'm Senator Gilbert Baker from Conway, co-chair of the Joint Budget Committee.